Can you feel it? Yes, after a productive month, food safety enthusiasts, one and all, can now come together for another exciting FSMA Friday. It's kind of like an unofficial holiday. Well, my name is Jim Albright, and though I don't have any hors d'oeuvres to serve in my hostly duties, we do have a smorgasbord of tips and tools to share with you that will hopefully help you and your team relieve some of that well, we'll just say stress that comes bubbling up when a food safety inspector comes knocking on your door. But before we begin, I'd like to welcome many of the new FSMA Friday friends we have joining us today. This is a monthly series for food and beverage manufacturers, processors, or distributors to get regular updates, insights, and guidance around changes within the Food Safety Modernization Act. It is brought to you by Safety Chain and the Acheson Group, and this is your chance to not only learn about methodologies and tools that will help you consistently meet FSMA requirements, but also get some of your food safety questions answered. Now, just some housekeeping items. All attendee mics have been muted, but we are, of course, going to leave room at the end for questions. So please, at any time during the presentation, do put your questions into the question panel, and we will try to get through them all. But if we do run out of time, don't worry. Our special speaker today will definitely want to come and follow up with those questions, and we will certainly get back to you. And yes, we are recording this presentation, and you can expect to see the recording and today's slides in your inbox later on today. All right, I'd like to introduce you to my guest of honor and your featured presenter, Mary Hoffman. She is the Senior Director of Food Safety at the Acheson Group. And as you can see, she is quite knowledgeable when it comes to food safety requirement compliance, and she has over 20 years of experience in that field. So, Mary, I do remember you had done a presentation called How to Become Recall Ready a couple of years back, and it was just chock full of best practices from proactive record keeping to internal audit processes. And I think today's topic is definitely going to extend upon what we learned during that presentation. So I'm excited.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always fun to have these conversations, to take a minute to focus on a specific topic, keep people up to date, and I really appreciate your enthusiasm for these things.
Yeah, well, we always have fun on FSMA Friday. Well, we have some FSMA updates, don't we? I think we're ready to dive into those.
Yeah, so as you know, each time we have one of these sessions, we try to come with some developments that have happened. This is FSMA Friday, but we kind of keep it a little more general to what have we seen coming out from the FDA that's new, that might be applicable to some of the folks that are on the call. So just a few things that we've seen since the last session. The first one is that the FDA shared some updates on their efforts to better understand PFAS in the general food supply. So the PFAS, those are a group of chemicals that are used in a wide variety of products like stain-resistant fabrics, cleaning products, and paints. And these can enter the food supply through plants and animals that are grown or raised in contaminated areas. Also possible for very small amounts to enter foods through things like packaging and cookware. So since these chemicals and exposure to them have been linked to health effects in the past, the FDA has been working to better understand PFAS in foods, and they began testing fresh and processed foods for PFAS in 2019. So they provided a recent update that includes, their testing results, their continuing efforts to supplement their data and their monitoring activities, and they've provided an updated analytical method to measure PFAS. So if that is of interest to you, go check that out to learn more. And then the other two here are pretty specific to two different industries, but they're worth a mention in case we have folks on the call that are interested. So the comment period was reopened for a draft guidance on sampling recommendations for seafood subject to detention without physical examination, which we often just shorten to DWPE because we love our acronyms. But this guidance was intended to provide recommendations for collecting samples for testing when fish and fishery products offered for import into the United States are subject to DWPE due to the appearance of adulteration. And this guidance is also intended to help foreign manufacturers and processors of these products to introduce evidence to support their request to have products removed from the DWPE. So they opened that comment period back up at the industry's request. You now have until June 25th to submit comments if you're interested. And then the next one is about draft guidance for new dietary ingredient notification master files for dietary supplements. So this draft guidance responds to that industry's request for specific guidance on this topic. And that's available now, and you can submit comments on that one until June 3rd. So if any of those are interested to you, go out to the FDA website and check it out. All right, so now we'll move on to today's topic, which is mastering the unannounced regulatory inspection. So as you are likely very aware, in-person FDA inspections are back after sort of the COVID pause. You know, they took a little bit of a pause there when we were on lockdown, did more things remotely or through virtual document reviews. But that pause has been lifted, and the FDA is back out there conducting these inspections. We're hearing from the industry that the teams are really, if they haven't received a visit, they're expecting one. As you all know, these are very often unannounced, unscheduled visits, and of course that can make people pretty nervous. So we're doing everything we can to help our clients do what they can to prepare for those. So today I'm going to share some of those highlights, talk through some of the struggles we're seeing our clients experience with preparing and conducting regulatory inspections. And, you know, we just kind of wanted to share some of the best practices with this FSMA Friday audience. Specifically, we're going to talk through preparing your teams, how you can best manage the visit, including the document review and the facility walkthrough. How do you respond to observations, and sort of key takeaways or things you can do now to prepare for a regulatory inspection. So we will start with, you know, managing their arrival. So what do you do when they show up? So let's say they show up unannounced at your door on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock. So make sure that your frontline personnel know what to do. So depending on your facility, maybe this is a security guard at the gate, maybe it's a receptionist inside the front door. Make sure they're the ones who are going to be the first ones that interact with the regulatory agency. So make sure they're well prepared. Oftentimes we'll help our clients create a reference document or like a cheat sheet for those people and really explain, you know, first and foremost, who could a regulator be? So maybe, you know, for many on the call, this could be the FDA. It could be a state agency that's acting on behalf of the FDA. It could be a local inspection. Perhaps you have some USDA jurisdiction at your facility. So really clearly define for those frontline personnel who that might be that could be showing up representing a regulatory agency. Then outline, you know, what you want them to do. So you want them to request to see the investigator's credentials. And then you want to sort of follow your normal visitor protocols. So this includes things like reviewing your GMP requirements or your personal safety requirements at the door. A lot of times companies will have maybe a sheet that lists out those requirements and then a spot at the bottom for people to sign that they've seen it, that they've reviewed it, that they've agreed to it. Just know that the inspectors may not sign your documents. They may refuse to sign those. Prepare your staff that could happen and let them know what to do if that happens. A lot of times we suggest, okay, just note that down. Note that you shared the information, that they looked at it, but they didn't sign it, whatever the case might be. Also, then provide that frontline person a list of personnel who should be immediately notified when regulators arrive. Make sure there's lots of people and lots of phone numbers that they can work down. So if your main contact is busy, they're out in the facility so they don't have cell service, or out sick or on vacation, make sure there's a list. They work from the top to the bottom until they reach somebody to notify them that they're present. You really don't want to leave the inspectors waiting around in the entrance area for an extended period of time. Then either, somebody should escort them then to a conference room, an office, or whatever the area is that you can use throughout the duration of the inspection. All right, so we've successfully received them into the building. We set them up in a conference room. The next best thing to do then is to hold a brief opening meeting. You want to try to have site leaders, like cross-functional representation at this initial meeting, even if they have to call in if they're not physically present, both so those people are aware that this inspection is going on, so they're prepared to participate in parts of the inspection if they're called upon, and also, to show the agency, the management's commitment to food safety and regulatory compliance. Think through ahead of time to prepare, determine who should be pulled into this meeting. It's generally, like the site manager, the plant manager, maybe a production manager, human resources, supply chain manager, whoever is applicable at your facility. Brief them ahead of time so they're not caught completely off guard. Like, hey, if and when this happens, we'll be asking you to participate in this fashion. We also recommend that you designate someone to act as a scribe throughout the duration of the visit. And ideally, that would be that person's sole responsibility, is to take notes. What was said? What did they look like? It can be hard to juggle answering questions, showing documents, and taking notes. So if you can have somebody dedicated to that task, you'll be better off for it. Then during this opening meeting, you need to determine the purpose of the visit from the inspector. If it's the FDA, they'll often produce what's called a notice of inspection, or a Form 482. That should outline the purpose of their visit. FDA visits are generally classified as either routine or for-cause inspections. Routine, obviously, are just as they sound, right? The FDA has a cadence that they try to get inside of different types of facilities based on risk. Oftentimes, these are just more of a general overview of your programs, practices, and conditions in the facility. On the other hand, a for-cause visit means something prompted them to come and conduct an inspection. So this could be a customer complaint, a foodborne illness report related to your products. Maybe they pulled some products from the retail shelf and did some testing and got an undesirable test result. They could be there to follow up on something like that. A for-cause visit would be more focused on a particular area of concern and will likely involve a very deep dive into a particular area, a particular product or program. This could be like a micro control programs, or your allergen management, or your foreign material controls, whatever it was that prompted them to conduct this inspection, you can inspect then a deep dive into that area. At the conclusion of this opening meeting, you can excuse most of that cross-functional team at that time, but then ask them to be on standby if they're needed to speak to their area of responsibility during the visit. Obviously, you will still have your main inspection leaders that have been tagged with that responsibility and your scribe, but you don't need to have the entire management team in the room or following along with every moment of the inspection. A best practice that we work with our clients on from time to time is to create what we sometimes call a Dear Investigator letter. This is something that you can put together ahead of time. You can present it to them during the opening meeting, or you can use it yourself as a guide at the opening meeting. And this really, you may be on the spot, just you might forget something important if you don't have some kind of reference. So this is essentially putting all of these things you want to make sure you cover in one place so that you can address it in an organized manner. So this can include a general overview of your facility, your processes, and your products. You can share your company policies related to good manufacturing practices, health and safety requirements, the requirement that visitors have to be escorted at all times. Do make sure you have enough employees available and designated to escort inspectors if multiple inspectors are on site. Generally, we see that they will usually stick together during the facility walkthrough, but if they want to split up, your team should be prepared to split up with them. You might want to discuss, document sharing and confidentiality. Many places will create like a stamp or a watermark that they can put on documents when physical copies are shared with the inspectors. And if your company has a policy related to photographs, it's best to share that now during the opening meeting than to kind of be responding to these issues as they come up during the course of the inspection. I do have a few slides specifically related to photographs a bit later in this conversation. So we'll move on from that for now. All right, so we will talk through, a big part of the regulatory inspection will likely be a review of documents. You want to be organized and ready to provide documents on request. So I've got a section on document review. So it's important to really think about what records are required according to the regulation versus what may be considered sort of out of scope for a regulatory inspection. We know you are maintaining and running a lot of programs. You've got a lot of documents, a lot of procedures, a lot of records. So it's good to think through ahead of time what is required specific to the regulatory environment that you're operating in. I'm going to talk through a couple of examples in upcoming slides, but in general, these will be comprised of program documents like policies and procedures where you're saying what you're going to do. And then along with that, you'll have implementation records that are showing that you are doing what you said you were going to do. In addition to that, training records are often reviewed to show that personnel are qualified to conduct their duties, particularly when it comes to food safety related tasks. Things that might be considered out of scope are things that are proprietary information, not necessarily relevant to food safety or regulatory requirements. These can be things like product recipes, pricing information, HR, personnel type data, R&D information, and some of your quality programs. So again, a lot of your food safety and quality programs are managed closely together by the same team. Potentially you have like a third party program, a GFSI type program. All of that tends to get very closely grouped together. In practice, that's how it generally can work the best. But remember, for the purpose of a regulatory inspection, the FDA is mainly concerned with food safety. So if you can somehow separate out some of the quality programs during the document review, you can really streamline things, keep it focused on where you need the conversation to be focused. Oh, I think I skipped one. There we go. Okay, a little bit just general information about records. Since the inspectors will very likely be looking closely at records during their visit. So just in general, all records here's some guidelines. So you can share the original documents, true copies of your records, or you can keep electronic records. People ask these questions quite a bit. Does it have to be a piece of paper that I hand to them? No, it doesn't. But in any case, the documents need to be accurate. So indelible, don't use pencil. You shouldn't be able to, make changes without that being noted. And they need to be legible. You have to have real-time recording of values. So make sure the team knows it's not okay to pre-fill their form, even if they know the values are always going to be the same. Like, oh, I just filled this out ahead of time. It's always the same. If something's different, I'll go back and change it. That's not allowed. For good record keeping practices, you have to be recording values at the time that you're measuring those. You need to include enough detail to provide a clear picture of what happened and when, and make sure you are aware of and following the relevant regulations record retention requirements. So both the preventive controls for human food and the intentional adulteration rules have a minimum of 2 years retention after the date they were prepared. I mentioned the two of those again, since this is FSMA Friday. So I mentioned a couple of sort of FSMA related regulations, but each regulation will have their own specific record retention requirements clearly defined. And many companies have their own record retention policies that are often longer than this minimum requirement for the regulation. That's fine, right? It's at least 2 years according to the regulation. So if your company says 4 years, you are obviously still in compliance. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, the list of documents you're required to keep is specific to the regulation that you fall within. I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of widely applicable regulations for FSMA, since it's FSMA Friday. So here's a list of the kinds of documents that are required for the preventive controls for human food rule. So according to this regulation, you're required to have a food safety plan that covers all products manufactured under that regulation. The food safety plan must be signed by the owner, operator, or agent in charge at the facility. So the senior person at the site has to sign off on that plan when it is created and anytime changes are made. And I'm emphasizing this because this is a place where we sometimes see a gap when we're reviewing programs for our clients. If that's a gap for you, make sure you quickly tighten that one up. So your food safety plan is required to contain a hazard analysis covering and addressing risks associated with your ingredients, materials, and processes. That hazard analysis must be documented. You can expect inspectors to request to see that. Then based on the results of that hazard analysis, you might also need to have preventive controls to manage significant risks. This can include process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain preventive controls. For any of those identified in your plan, again, you have to have procedures for how you're going to manage that and implementation records that show you're doing what you're saying you're going to do, and that you're responding appropriately if and when things go wrong. This can include monitoring and verification records as well. And as I mentioned earlier, training records may be requested to show that personnel are qualified to conduct food safety related tasks. Additionally, a recall plan is a required program under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule, but it's only a required program if you have identified the need for a preventive control. Of course, it is highly recommended that all food companies have a recall plan, but if you have a preventive control, you can expect that the regulators could request to see your recall plan as well, because that's a requirement. So high level, that was an overview of documents that could be requested to be reviewed if you fall under the Preventive Controls for Human Food rule. It's not intended to be a detailed course on how to comply with that regulation. Just a reminder, whatever regulation you fall under is going to define what is required. Again, your food safety programs become pretty intertwined with other things like GFSI, quality. So separate out what is a regulatory requirement versus everything else when it comes to preparing for this inspection. All right, and again, I'll just briefly talk through one other FSMA regulation, so the intentional adulteration or food defense rule. So for me, this, the structure of it feels very similar to the preventive controls for human food rule, but this one is based on a vulnerability assessment, which is similar to a hazard analysis, but you are required to identify the highest risk steps, procedures, points in your manufacturing process for opportunities for a person with intent to cause wide-scale harm to public health, including acts of terrorism targeting the food supply. So, a slightly different angle on the assessment. It's a vulnerability assessment. And then based on the output of that, you may be required to implement mitigation strategies to address those risks. If you do identify those, again, you're going to need to have procedures to define what you're going to do and records to show that you're doing what you say you're doing. Training records are also required to show that people involved in the different phases of your food defense program are qualified to do their part in that program delivery. So, there's obviously many other regulations that you might be required to follow. If there are any areas when, you're thinking about this where you're a bit fuzzy about what is specifically required according to the regulations, the recommendation is to kind of go back, review the regulation, the guidance documents, and create a reference sheet for yourself that you can pull out when preparing for or participating in a regulatory inspection. So in general, a robust hazard analysis and decisions based on scientific evidence and risk-based criteria are key. Be prepared to speak confidently about the decisions that were made when you put your programs together. So when you conducted your food safety team or your food defense team conducted those assessments, the hazard analysis, you made some decisions about what are the potential hazards here. Which of these are significant? So we have to have controls in place. What controls do we put in place? What are the things we're going to monitor? Make sure you're able to speak to those and justify the decisions that were made. I'm a big proponent of having and using a justification column on those hazard analysis or vulnerability assessment forms where you can make notes and capture those conversations, make note of what references were used when you made those decisions. Because those are the places when and if a regulatory inspector wants to see, your hazard analysis, you have to be able to justify it. So some things you might use to help make those decisions are, FDA guidance documents, peer-reviewed journal, studies, reports, things like that. Make sure you document those, you can speak to that, and you have those available as a reference if needed. All right, an area where sometimes people struggle is when it comes to these three terms: monitoring, verification, and validation. So these are three different things. They have definitions. The definitions from the preventive control for human food rule. So for monitoring, conducting a planned sequence of observations or measurements to assess whether your control measures are operating as intended. Verification, application of methods, procedures, tests, in addition to monitoring, to determine whether a control measure is operating as intended and to establish the validity of the food safety plan. And then validation, obtaining and evaluating scientific and technical evidence that a control measure is capable of effectively controlling the identified hazards. If you're iffy on those, if you're worried that when put on the spot, you'll have trouble remembering which is which. Go back, make a list of what are the documents that we have here that are considered monitoring, that are considered verification, that are considered validation. And the reason I'm making a point about this is, again, we, with our clients, we sometimes will conduct mock FDA inspections. And sometimes we'll say, okay, show us your verification records for that preventive control. And you can tell pretty quickly when people aren't sure exactly what that is. Sometimes they'll just start pulling up different documents, or, they'll just start kind of showing us things that don't technically fall into that definition of verification. So pretty important that you know what is being asked for before you start pulling up and sharing documents. And it's okay to pause, to ask clarifying questions, ask specifically what's being asked for, even consult your notes, consult your colleagues quickly before moving forward with sharing the information. All right, so additionally, you should have documented corrective and preventive action records for any and all deviations from your food safety and food defense programs. Within these CAPA records, you should include, what you did to identify and correct an issue, what you did to reduce the likelihood that that same issue would happen again. Also include, information to show that you did an evaluation of potentially impacted food and what was the disposition of that food. And then evidence that any potentially unsafe food did not enter commerce. And make sure that your CAPA form or your CAPA log, or however you're managing this, clearly addresses all of these items listed above. All right, consumer and customer complaints. So regulatory inspectors might ask to see your complaints, your complaint data. The complaints they are interested in would be related to food safety. So like we talked about in the programs and the records, it's helpful if you have the ability to separate out quality complaints so you can focus solely on any related to food safety, kind of public health types of concerns. If you do have to show any that are related to food safety, focus on the follow-up. Make sure it's clearly documented what you did to address the immediate concern and to prevent recurrence. And make sure you can exhibit that you have appropriate controls in place to prevent that from happening again. Also, just a note of caution, if you're using lack of customer complaints as either a justification within your food safety plan or maybe a verification activity in your food safety plan, you're definitely opening yourself up then for the inspector to ask to see those programs. So not saying to use them or not use them in that manner, but just do be aware and be prepared to share those if you're calling those out in your food safety plan. All of this being said, remember that your goal is to maintain a positive relationship with regulators and to clearly exhibit that you are in compliance with the regulations and that you are appropriately controlling food safety hazards, right? You want to be professionally cordial. You don't want to overshare or share more than is asked for, but at the same time, you really don't want it to appear confrontational or that you're hiding something. So, answer their questions and be honest, obviously, and do your best to maintain that positive relationship. All right. So moving on to the other major component of a regulatory inspection, and that's the facility walkthrough. So we'll talk through a few things related to that. So some walkthrough basics, as we mentioned before, make sure someone's available to escort the inspectors at all times. Ask them kind of specifically what they would like to see, and then the representatives from the company guide them to those areas. Make sure you're following your standard practices, so whatever your GMP requirements are. If you've got a defined flow, we only move from finished to raw, or however that works with your hygienic zoning, follow those standard practices and do not take shortcuts. People may be nervous and may be trying to be real easy to deal with, but you still need to follow your prescribed programs. Answer their questions as you go along, describe practices as you are asked, and again, do your best to guide them through your process. All right, so let's talk about what can go wrong during the facility walkthrough. Things that can go wrong include process failures. So maybe the metal detector doesn't reject a test piece while you're conducting the inspection. Or maybe there's some GMP gaps that happen while you're on the walkthrough. Someone blows right past the hand washing station in front of the team, or you see somebody wearing torn or dirty gloves. Or maybe you'll see some infrastructure issues. Maybe there's a drain backing up or a roof leaking while you're out there doing that facility walkthrough. So, I mean, this is a manufacturing facility, right? Things can and do go wrong. If this happens during a regulatory inspection, this is your opportunity to show the inspector how you react to these kinds of situations on a daily basis. So try to remain calm and follow your normal practices. And I've got another slide on this. So again, follow your standard protocols for responding to an incident. So maybe this includes stopping the line, putting product on hold, establishing a clean break, and then conducting an investigation, identifying the root cause that led to the issue. Follow your standard CAPA process that we talked about on a previous slide. Make sure that all gets documented. And whenever possible, correct issues right away and show evidence to the inspector while they're still on site that you quickly address those issues. Sometimes, that can make a difference between receiving a formal documented deviation like a 483 and not receiving one. If it's not a widespread incident and your team quickly responds to it, you might be able to keep that as kind of a minor observation. Oop, I think I went too far there. Jim, I knew it was going to happen. All right, so product sampling, environmental monitoring. So what do you do if the inspectors want to take samples? They do have the legal authority to do so. So expect that this could happen. Decide ahead of time on what your policy will be. And I've got some recommendations here. So if they take samples or swabs, make sure you find out what they're going to test for. What organisms specifically are they going to test for? Place product on hold if that's relevant, pending results. If they pull finished product, put any remaining inventory of that on hold, pending results. Conduct a clean break if that's appropriate. And take lots of notes and potentially photographs if they are taking samples. You obviously want to note exactly what product, what lot number, if it's product samples. If they're doing swabs, take good notes about where those are being taken and potentially take some photographs because it can be hard to describe in enough detail when it comes to an environmental swab. And then a bit about taking duplicate samples. So this is where, decide as a company in advance what your approach will be. if they pull samples? Do we want to also take samples and send them for testing independently? Think through what you would do with the results if you did that. So let's say the FDA took an environmental swab and you also took the same swab. They send it to be tested, you send it to be tested independently. Let's say the FDA gets a positive result and you get a negative result. Like, what are you going to do with those results? Will that really make a difference in them finding a positive result? Or worse, what if the FDA result is negative and yours is positive? Now what? You might have just opened up a whole different issue that needs to be addressed. Sometimes we recommend pull the sample and hold on to it. And then once, you've had a moment to think, then decide whether or not you want to send that for testing or not. So it's tough questions. We're not here to tell people, yes, do test, no, don't test, but we do recommend your team, it's very specific to your facility, your processes, your approach, what you decide to do, but have those conversations ahead of time and document that in your policy so that when you're kind of on the hot seat and this is actually happening, you have a plan that you can follow. And really the best way to be prepared for that is to just maintain a robust environmental monitoring program in your facility. So you want to know your facility. You don't want to wait and have regulators find something in your plant for you. So make sure your environmental monitoring program follows a seek and destroy approach. If it's there, you are trying to find it. And if you do, you have a documented investigation and what you did to eliminate that as an issue in your facility. Okay, what if they want to take photos? This has been, and I think still remains, a bit of a contentious issue in the industry. Some companies try to push back on whether or not regulators have the right or authority to take photos. So you have a couple of options when it comes to photos in your facility. The first option is you let them, right? So you decide as a company, we're okay with this. We're not going to object. We're going to allow them to take photos. Obviously, you want to follow this. You're escorting the inspector while they're taking the photos. You can request them to frame the photos to protect proprietary information. You might consider taking duplicate photos so that if there's discussions about that later, your team has that same photo that you can be, reviewing and taking a look at to see, what risks might be presented there. You might take the exact same photo plus one that's a little further out to give a little more context for your own team when you're considering what the implications of the photo might be. All right, option 2 is enforcing a no photo or video policy. If your team decides on this approach, make sure that the policy is clearly communicated to the inspector right at the beginning of that meeting, in that opening session. Include the reasons for not allowing pictures. You can talk to protecting trade secrets, business confidential information, etc. You definitely don't want to give the impression that you are trying to impede their inspection in any way. Make sure that you are consistently applying that policy with regulators, customers, and you have, this posted prominently in relevant areas. If this is the approach you're going to take, you'll want to engage your legal counsel or other knowledgeable resource in this area. And a couple more thoughts on that from TAG's perspective. So regulators may point to some court decisions to assert their right to take photos. So this may not be an easy pushback. They might not ask for permission. They might just be out there and start taking photos. So, what is your team going to do in that kind of situation? Discuss with your team, right, is this worth the fight? If they're out there and they start taking pictures and you start trying to, insert yourself and stop them, you're really potentially changing the tone. This maybe becomes more confrontational. So think through it. Is it worth the fight? And maybe the answer for you is yes, it is. And that's fine. Just be sure to thoroughly prepare your team then to respond. What should they do if they're asked if they can take photos? What should they do if someone just starts taking photos? And then just be, have the resources there to back them up if they're instructed to push back on that. All right, closing out the inspection. So conduct a closing meeting to obtain feedback from the FDA inspectors. Just confirm that you're going to receive a copy of the detailed establishment inspection report. It's pretty standard that you would. If there are any observations noted, they may issue a Form 483 at the conclusion of the inspection. So they'll do this if they observed anything that in their judgment constitutes violations of the regulations. If you receive a 483, you will want to submit a response to that in a timely manner. Generally, we say, within 2 weeks or like 15 days. Even if you don't receive a 483, but they verbally mention some minor observations or things that they saw during the visit, make sure you're still documenting those yourself and following up on those. A very common thing to happen is when they show up, they're going to be looking at, what did I see last time I was here? Or what did another inspector see last time they were here? Did they follow up on that? So make sure, you include that in your CAPA log or however you're documenting your follow-up to sort of inspection debits or audit debits, things like that. Okay, so I'm going to end the conversation with, what are kind of some top things you can do to get yourself prepared and your team prepared for a regulatory inspection. So create for your team a regulatory inspection procedure. If you already have one, go back, brush it off, revisit it, thinking about the things we talked about here. Make sure you're capturing who does what is your approach, what is your company stance on, the different topics that we've discussed here. The second thing you can do is to really organize your documents and records. Like we talked about, clearly define what is a regulatory document. What can you expect them to ask for if they're conducting a regulatory inspection? Get those organized, get yourself a reference sheet, whatever you have to do to, reduce some of the stress of responding and looking and finding exactly what they're looking for. Review the most recent inspection report. Make sure that anything that was documented there, even if it were not a 483, that it was, you did something about it. You considered it, you implemented something. Make sure that's well documented. Review your company policies on those kind of tricky scenarios, particularly if they take samples or if they take photos, and conduct a mock regulatory inspection. Have somebody act as if they're the FDA inspector and just see how they do. Put them in the hot seat, and you can really identify areas where, hey, we could be better at this. We could use more practice at that. And that is all that I have.
Wow, we just walked through the whole process. There was a ton of stuff packed in this. Excellent, Mary. Thank you so much. Um, I want to start at the beginning here because it really does kind of depend on how how everybody kind of knows their place whenever an inspector shows up. And in doing that, you mentioned a couple of tips and tricks regarding, say, like a reference document, having a list of people that you need to call. There's obviously your later point around like, hey, just go through your process as you normally would if this inspector wasn't standing by your side, but make sure that you have the right proper documentation at the ready should somebody just walk in through the door. But being able to kind of sift through that and filter out all of the stuff that doesn't necessarily apply to what the inspector is looking for. So there's a
Right.
lot of stuff under there, and it just seems kind of like, well, a little overwhelming. So I kind of want to get started around what is the best way for people to kind of put their minds together and get, um, I don't know if it's a checklist or some kind of like document that outlines SOP for an inspector showing up, which includes things like how do you sort through which documents are required, or how do you make sure that you have the training documents for hazard analysis prepared and at the
Yeah.
ready?
Yeah. So for me, it's kind of two different things. There's a procedure for what to do when they show up, who's doing what, who's greeting them, who's leading the inspection, who's attending the opening meeting, those kinds of things.
Hmm.
And then there's managing all of that stuff that's part
Exactly.
of your food safety programs. So the former is a little easier to get our minds around. The latter takes a little bit more work, but the good news is a lot of your program documents will already kind of list out what are the records that we're creating as part of this.
Hmm.
So for example, if you have got a process preventive control in place, your summary chart is going to show you, here's what we're monitoring, when we're monitoring, how often, who's going to do it, what's our
Right.
proactive action as things go wrong. Most standard templates for that, the very last column is titled records. So right there, you've got a list of these are the records that we are creating to show that we're implementing these programs. So, ideally in a perfect state, you'll already kind of have it maybe in a few different places within your programs, and you can just go and pull them all together. However, the regulations themselves call out pretty specifically what program documents and records you're required to keep to be in compliance with a particular regulation. It's
Hmm.
tough to do on a call like this because everybody's in regulatory environment is a little different. They have different rules they have to comply with. But if they go right out to the regulation or guidance documents for that regulation, they should be able to put together a list of what is required.
Got it. Yeah. Um, I'm looking at the questions that are coming in, and there's a few questions here that are really kind of around that whole, hey, we have some company policies that either require or prevent certain actions from happening. So one example is our company policy says that an investigator needs to sign their GMP and safety requirements. How do they respond if the investigator rejects signing those requirements?
Yeah, and that's a really good point because that happens.
Hmm.
That does happen. We often see that they will not sign that. So I think just knowing that, review that policy and have that conversation internally. What we often suggest is, kind of in that spot on that visitor form where it says to sign and they refuse to sign, go ahead and make a note. Like, I reviewed this document with them and they refused to sign,
Right.
and talk
Similar to
through,
pictures, right? Yeah.
yeah, and talk through with your internal team, like, is that going to be good enough for us? Or, what do we need to, if not, what do you suggest we do instead?
Yeah. Generalizing here, how often would you say that happens where an inspector would just blatantly say, no, I'm not going to sign this. I know this is your policy, but I'm not.
It's very likely that they will refuse to
Uh,
sign it.
Interesting. Okay. All right. I have a question here around the environmental monitoring program. Is that a requirement?
Not necessarily, no. Not so. Again, this is it's a specific question for different types of facilities. But if you're regulated under the preventive controls for human food rule, you're
Hmm.
producing ready-to-eat foods that are exposed to the processing environment, then as a generalization, you would likely be expected to have an environmental monitoring program. But I think the point that we're making here is if you want to really be prepared, like if you're concerned about a regulator coming in and doing a swabathon or taking swabs and what they might find, the
Hmm.
best way to prepare for that is to know on your own, especially if you're making ready to eat foods that are exposed to the processing environment.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. So
Are
really
there any
more of a recommendation than a requirement is what we were going for on that slide.
are there any restrictions around areas in which a swap can happen or not happen?
In terms of a regulatory inspector, no. They could want to, if they want to take a swab of a food contact surface, I mean, they can,
What about like
but
public areas such as like the break room or hallway or something like that?
oh, that would be very unexpected.
Yeah. Okay. Just making
But think
sure.
through, yeah, oftentimes, and I didn't get into it here, but if they do want to take a swab of a food contact surface, you want to think through what are we going to do if they do that? Think through that ahead of time. Do you for sure want to put product on hold and think through, how far back, like since the last clean break?
Right.
Do you want to stop right then and there and do another clean break? So yeah, really think through those things again. So you're in a good spot to respond quickly if and when that happens.
I have a question here from Shelley. When a risk assessment is required for a specific requirement, is a written RA required, or can the business be prepared to speak on how and why they decided what controls are required?
You're required to have a written hazard analysis. They do not prescribe the format. But yeah,
Okay.
you need to have a written document.
Okay. Um, I have a question here from William around, I know you had a slide around the confusion between monitoring versus verification versus validation. And I know you gave a couple of examples, but would you mind giving a few more for verification versus validation?
Yeah. So the little shortcut that my boss, one of my earliest bosses, when I started working in this field, told me, and it's stuck with me to this day. Maybe it'll help you, maybe it won't. But he told me validation is asking the question, will it work? Verification is asking the question, is it working?
Hmm.
So a validation oftentimes is a scientific study that says if you cook X product at this temperature for this amount of time, you can adequately control for the presence of a pathogen, a specific pathogen. That would be considered a validation study, or it could be something that your facility does in-house to prove out that a process can work to control the identified hazard. Verification activities are you're going along and making sure it's working on a day-to-day. So
Right.
sanitation verification, they get done with sanitation, somebody goes out, does a visual inspection, it's visibly clean, maybe they also do an ATP swab or something. Those are things that would be considered verification activities.
Got it. Yep, that makes sense. I see that we are actually over time. So thanks for hanging out with us a little bit, everybody. We do have a few more questions we didn't get to, but as I said earlier, we will get back to you soon with those follow-up questions and answers. And also, this presentation is recorded. So again, please take a look at your inbox later today. You'll get this presentation and the slides very soon. If you have any more questions around how to get ready for an inspection or to become audit ready, you can certainly reach out to the folks at Acheson Group. Mary, I know you're always ready and willing to help solve some of these problems for folks, but you can check them out at achesongroup.com. And if you want some excellent reading material, we've got plenty over at safetychain.com. We've been partnered with the Acheson Group for a while, and so through that partnership, we've created a lot of documents for you to go through and get some best practices. So be sure to check it out. So with that, thank you again, Mary, for an outstanding presentation. You always do a great job. And I do appreciate everybody for joining us today. And we certainly look forward to seeing you next month on FSMA Friday.
Thanks all. Have a great weekend.
You do the same. Take care.